When we think about conservation, often what comes to mind are beautiful national parks, endangered animals, and wild nature. But conservation has also been a tool of colonialism. In this video, we will look at some of the impacts that colonialism has had on conservation in the Canadian context, but similar stories have played out all over the world. At the heart of Canada's Parks and Protected Areas system is the idea that nature is fragile and in need of protection, that wilderness is pristine nature, untouched by humans. Protected areas are meant to be places where human influence is null and nature is left alone. These wild spaces are also often depicted as having been found by people who were then compelled to protect their beauty. One often told story is how in 1883 railroad workers discovered a splendid hot spring tucked away in the Rocky Mountains. These hot springs quickly became a major tourist attraction and soon became the cornerstone of Canada's first national park, Banff. But of course, these railroad workers were not the first people to find or use these hot springs. Various indigenous nations in the area, including the Nakota and the Ktunaxa, considered the hot springs to be sacred waters and used them to cure illness. Stories like this, of people discovering new landscapes and the romantic notions of untouched wilderness, are the building blocks of the Canadian Protected Areas system. But they are a flawed and ignorant version of history. When the lands that would become protected areas were discovered by settlers, they weren't empty. They weren't untouched landscapes devoid of humans. They were populated by Indigenous peoples who had been there since time immemorial. The landscapes of North America are also not untouched, pristine nature. Indigenous peoples drastically altered their landscapes all across the continent through burning, grazing, and other practices. What settlers saw as pristine wilderness was actually the product of millennia of human intervention. This is the myth of pristine wilderness, the idea that nature and wilderness is separate from and untouched by humans. Protected areas are built around the concept of protecting pristine wilderness from the dangers of the human hand, but the ironic thing is that so many of these landscapes are actually the product of human intervention. Canada is commonly thought of as a few cities and towns in a sea of untouched wilderness. This idealized version of the country is seen in much of our settler art and literature, like the works of the Group of Seven and Farley Mowat. And many settler Canadians see wilderness, and in particular the national park system, as a critical piece of our national identity. But the concept of Canada as a vast and empty wilderness is a Eurocentric one that erases Indigenous influence on and relationships with the land. Because one of the key goals of parks and protected areas was to protect nature from humans, Indigenous peoples were often treated like an infestation that posed a threat to the landscape. For example, when Banff National Park was established in 1885, the park superintendent, George Stewart, demanded that all of the Indigenous peoples be removed from the area, saying, quote, "Their destruction of the game and depredations among the ornamental trees make their too frequent visits to the park a matter of great concern," end quote. This set up a pattern of forced removals of Indigenous peoples from their lands to create parks and protected areas across the continent. In 1936, the Kisi-Kowtin and Ojibwe Band was established from the newly created Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba and forced to live on a reserve outside of the park boundaries. To ensure that they did not return, their homes were set on fire by park wardens right in front of them. Under the National Parks Act, those who lived in newly established parks were suddenly declared squatters, as the act stated that, quote, "No person shall locate, settle upon, use, or occupy any portion of the said public park," end quote. This gave park staff the right to remove and exclude so-called trespassers. Of course, this part of the act was not applied equally to all people, as settler towns and communities were a part of many protected areas from day one. Returning to the example of Banff, a town of the same name exists within the park boundaries, established around the Banff Springs Hotel, which first opened in 1888, 3 years after First Nations people were removed from the park. The primary function of the town was to serve wealthy white tourists, so indigenous peoples were excluded from the town, including the Nakota and Ktunaxa, who would utilize the area to hunt, fish, trade, and travel. In particular, the lands that became known as Banff National Park hold important significance to the Stoney Nakoda Nation. Until the 1980s, the Stoney Nakoda were only allowed back into the park as part of Banff Indian Days. Banff Indian Days were held from the late 1890s until 1978 and were one of Banff's main tourist attractions during that time period. For a few days each spring, thousands of tourists would flock to the park to see members of the Stoney Nakoda Nation, who were only allowed back into the park if they adhered to certain stereotypes, dressing and dancing and singing in particular ways. Failure to adhere to these stereotypes could result in them being permanently banned from the park or even imprisoned. Like display animals in a zoo, the Stoney Nakoda were expected to open their teepees to visitors, put on shows, and pose for photographs with settler tourists. Newspaper articles promoting the event talk about there being no better prize than getting a photo of an indigenous child, and how, like an animal, you could entice them into the shot with a piece of chocolate. When in the park for Banff Indian Days, every move of the Stoney Nakoda was carefully controlled, as park managers believed that if they were allowed to go around the park on their own, they would ruin it, disturb the balance of nature, and destroy all of the animals. It wasn't until 2010 that the Banff superintendent formally welcomed the Stoney Nakoda to the park and formally recognized the park as part of their homelands, taking a small step on the long road to reconciliation. However, to my knowledge, there has never been a formal apology for the exploitation of Banff Indian Days. Today, Banff Indian Days looks a lot different. The Stoney Nakoda have reclaimed the event, which is now a cultural celebration and a time to reconnect with their land and pass on traditions in the Nakota language to the next generation. Most of the week-long event is closed off to the general public, with the exception of the closing powwow. However, this event is still strictly controlled by Parks Canada and activities are limited. In particular, hunting is still not allowed within the park boundaries, though First Nations-led hunts have occurred in other national parks, including in neighboring Jasper National Park. Throughout the 20th century, Indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands under the guise of ecological preservation, what Robert Jargo calls green colonialism. It wasn't until 1973 in the landmark Supreme Court Calder case, which acknowledged that Aboriginal title to land existed prior to colonization, that things started to slowly change. It is important to understand that while the homes of Indigenous peoples are no longer typically burned to make way for protected areas, and they are no longer put on display to perform for tourists, the effects that these actions had are still being felt, and colonialism and conservation is not something to be relegated to the past. Although Indigenous-led conservation efforts are starting to gain more of a presence, many protected areas are still being established without Indigenous consent, and all across the continent, land use decisions are being made without Indigenous peoples. This history and its ongoing effects is critical to keep in mind as we move towards bigger and bolder conservation targets. The federal government of Canada is currently committed to 30% protection by 2030, but the question is, how do they plan to get there? Are they planning to move forward towards the target with Indigenous peoples? Or will they go on without them, continuing the patterns of the past? The relationships that are needed to establish an IPCA or gaining Indigenous consent for a different type of protected area takes time. Is the government willing to invest the time and energy needed to build these relationships, or are they going to forego consent in order to meet these targets on their preferred schedule?